Good afternoon, everyone. This is Bryce Duke, and I'm going to be presenting to you a PowerPoint over the beginnings of the First World War. Now, I'm going to be posting PowerPoints in the rest of this module over the rest of the war, but I wanted to narrate through this one because the beginnings of the First World War can be very confusing. There was a really complicated alliance structure and a lot of real moving pieces that can get really confusing. So I wanted to walk you through this just so you could hear it from someone rather than just reading it. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So the beginnings of the First World War really began out of a feeling of nationalism for several different smaller countries, which is one of the forces that led to the uneasiness in Europe. So nationalism is almost like a very accelerated, very high level of patriotism that a country can have. And nationalism in these countries that are listed here, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Great Britain, Russia, Italy, and France, kind of came about after they had all been fighting wars with one another over the last couple of centuries in the 17th and 16th centuries, especially. These wars that they fought with one another, some of them were lost, some of them were won by all of these different countries, and they really were just feeling themselves, honestly. They wanted to prove to everyone that they were the best in everything. Their way of life was the best, their form of government was the best, and they wanted to make sure that everyone knew about it. So these countries have been fighting wars with one another, and they've been trying to prove to everyone what was the best about each of them. And they were also in competition for materials and markets, as well as influence over the other countries around Europe, as well as the rest of the world. And naturally, whenever you have all of these countries that have been together with each other for so long and had so many different rivalries, both ethnically and culturally, you're going to have rivalries that grow out of that. Rivalries grew out of that, as well as with territorial disputes. So over the last probably 1,000 years, the national boundaries between many of these countries were just complete messes that were always disputed. No one could really determine whether or not what the actual boundary was where both sides would be happy with it. So you have rivalries, and eventually wars would be fought to determine who wanted what land so that they could grow. With that rivalry in growing land, you have what's called imperialism. So imperialism was another force that set the stage for war in Europe. And imperialism, it says down here at the bottom, was a quest for colonies that often pushed nations to the brink of war and led to mistrust between the countries. So many of these nations were going about trying to grow their own empires, in a sense, by going after colonies all around the world. So perhaps the most famous colony of all would be the United Kingdom, or Great Britain's colony of the United States before it became an independent nation. France and the Great Britain had claims to Canada, Spain, and Mexico. Several countries in South America were claimed by all kinds of different countries in Europe, as well as Africa and Southeast Asia in particular. So in the 1890s, nationalism led to a European arms race, which helped to promote the policy of militarism. So militarism, as it says down here at the bottom, is glorifying military power and keeping an army prepared for war. Oops. So in this case, all of these countries, it's almost as if they knew that they were going to be going to war with one another once again. So they wanted to make sure that they were as well equipped as they could possibly be so that they could bring as much heat as they could to whatever war they had. Because, again, whenever you have this heightened sense of nationalism, you want to prove to everyone that you are the best. And in this case, being the best meant if you could win a war. So now we're going to talk about the complex alliance structure that I mentioned earlier, which helped bring about the beginning of this war. So Otto von Bismarck, the man pictured here, used war to unify Germany in the several decades that preceded World War I. Once he was satisfied with the amount of land that he had turned into Germany, he turned his energies towards maintaining peace within Germany. Germany, if you didn't know, is made of several different smaller cultural areas in all different kinds of Germany. So Otto von Bismarck remarkably actually helped to unify all of these different cultures. And in 1879, he formed the dual alliance with Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary was one of the geographic neighbors of Germany, and they were very similar culturally to Germany. They spoke a very similar language and did several similar things. So he wanted to make sure that if there was going to be a war, that he would have a friend on his side where they could share a common cause. Germany would then face a two-front war with Britain as well as with Russia to their east. Germany was very, let's say, belligerent. They were very aggressive in how they wanted to expand throughout Europe, and they wanted to expand their influence. So the Kaiser, Otto von Bismarck, decided he wanted to challenge Britain as they were threatening on his ability to expand and to do whatever he wanted. So Great Britain enlarged their fleet, which gave them naval superiority over Germany, and entered with an alliance with France, which, as you can see down here in the lower left of Germany, was one of their neighbors as well. And Germany and France had had different altercations with one another throughout their history. So this was called, and this alliance, another word for it was the French word for an alliance called an entente. So in 1904, France and Great Britain entered an entente. Then in 1907, Great Britain made another entente with France and Russia called the Triple Entente, which means that all three of these countries would have each other's back against Germany and Austria-Hungary in case of a war. So the inciting event of the war was made in a crisis in the Balkans. Now, the Balkans is a collection of several small countries that all are somewhat ethnically similar, but also different at the same time, enough to where they wanted to live in different countries. So it's like Yugoslavia at the time, Slovenia, Slovakia. There's several different ethnic groups, as well as some very similar races of Europeans. By 1907, there were two different rival camps that existed in Europe. So what we talked about earlier, we had the German and Austro-Hungary alliance, as they also added Italy into this to make the Triple Alliance. And then we just talked about the Triple Entente, which was Great Britain, France, and Russia. They both were disagreeing with one another, and this would end up being the main belligerents of the war, the two different sides, as you would call it. So the Balkans were called Europe's powder keg because, as I said, there were many ethnic groups and a long history of nationalist uprisings and ethnic clashes. So this several different group of ethnic groups and this heightened sense of nationalism as a powder keg would be if one small spark could cause it to explode, and that is exactly what happened, which started this war. So the war began when the Austro-Hungarian leader Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie, which are pictured on the right, were shot on June 28, 1914 by Gavrilo Princip in Sarajevo, which is in Bosnia, one of the Balkan states. So the assassin Gavrilo Princip was part of the Black Hand Society, which was a small anarchist terrorist group. So they weren't put on any kind of official state business by the Serbians to assassinate this leader. But because the assassin was Serbian, Austria decided to punish Serbia, though the Serbian government had nothing to do with it. So on July 23rd, as you can see right here, they were assassinated on June 28th. So in less than a month, Austria presented Serbia with an ultimatum that the Serbian leaders agreed to most of Austria's demands, but Austria would not negotiate, and on July 28th, Austria declared war. So Austria basically told them that they had to find a way to prove that they were not involved in the assassination, and they couldn't. So as a result, Austria-Hungary declared war. On that same day, Serbia's ally, Russia, moved troops toward the Austrian borders, and leaders urged negotiations, but it was too late. So this troop movement of Serbia's ally, Russia, this is all part of that really tangled up alliance structure that allowed for the different countries that may not have been directly involved in this war to have the back of those that were, which would just make the war snowball. We have different countries, which means more people, more weapons, more deaths, and it was just a giant snowball effect. So that talks about really the beginning of the war. If you look on the next PowerPoints that'll be posted, this will tell you more about how the war really got going after this, the different events, the different battle tactics, all kinds of different things, and also the United States entry into the war and the finish of the war with about a year after the United States entered. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you learned something from it.